So it's really a pleasure for me. I'm Dr. Mark Brennan, by the way, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the president of Princeton Adult School. And it's really a pleasure to be able to introduce Ambassador Barbara Bodine to you tonight. Professor Bodine is a lecturer in public and international affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School. She's also the director of Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative, which I'll tell you about a little bit. And she carries yet another title, that's Diplomat in Residence. But this Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative is an innovative program at the Woodrow Wilson School that encourages and supports undergraduate students, I guess primarily, committed to careers as a career foreign service or federal public service through scholarships to them, intensive language training, internships and fellowships, and mentoring. She lectures on U.S. diplomacy in the Persian Gulf region and on Yemen, which will be the topic for tonight. Ms. Bodine has spent over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, and these were spent primarily on the Arabian Peninsula and the greater Persian Gulf areas and issues. Specifically, the U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counterterrorism, and governance and reform. Her tour as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen encompassed the years of 1997 to 2001. And I saw that her tour in Yemen coincidentally ended, I think, the last day of August of 2001, just coincidentally just a couple days before the 9/11 terror attacks. But her tour saw enhanced support for democratization in that country, and increased security and counterterrorism cooperation. Also the establishment of a Coast Guard, resumption of Fulbright scholarships for Yemeni students, initiation of a $40 million per year economic assistance and development program, and an indigenous land mine awareness and demining program. Ms. Bodine also served in Baghdad as a deputy principal officer during the Iran-Iraq War, and in Kuwait as deputy chief of mission during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 to 1991. And again, she was seconded to the Department of Defense in Iraq after the 9/11 terrorism attacks in 2003 as the senior State Department official and the first coalition coordinator for reconstruction in Baghdad and in the central governance. In addition to several assignments in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, she was Associate Coordinator for Counterterrorism Operations and subsequently Acting Overall Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Director of East African Affairs. She was also Dean of the School of Professional Studies of the Foreign Service Institute and Senior Advisor for International Security Negotiations and Agreements in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. Since she left government service, Ambassador Bodine has been Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Governance Initiative in the Middle East at the Kennedy Institute up at Harvard, and Fellow at the School's Center for Public Leadership and the Institute of Politics. She's also the Robert Wilhelm Fellow at MIT's Center for International Studies, and she's taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara, lectures at universities around the country, and is a frequent media commentator. Ambassador Bodine is the recipient of many awards, too many for me to announce here, but she's received Distinguished Service Awards and Distinguished Alumni Awards from UC Santa Barbara, which is where she got her undergraduate degree, cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, as well as a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And she's a Regent Emerita at the University of California. Professor Bodine is going to be talking tonight. The title of her talk is Yemen, Anatomy of a Revolution, Prognosis on a Transition. Please welcome Ambassador Barbara Bodine.
That's a little bit better. I hope you don't mind. And I think it makes the map look a little bit better too. Okay. So as long as I have enough, I can still read my notes too. So anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. It's always a pleasure to talk with groups of interested citizens about otherwise kind of obscure countries around the world. Many people have heard about, well, not a lot of people. People have heard about Yemen. They're not always able to find it on a map. One of the things that I started doing a couple of years ago with my students is giving them maps of the Middle East with all of the place names removed and having them fill it in. And I found it was remarkably salutary in dealing with Princeton students to remind them of the things they actually don't know. And gets their attention every year. And Yemen is always one of the countries that they can't find. So I did think, I did try to find a map. There aren't a lot of really good maps of Yemen, but this is one of the best ones I could find. And just kind of get you a little situated before we get into the substance. It does sit down in the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. I always think of these as cat toys, not pointers. Start doing this, and I expect Wicca and Rania to show up and start chasing it. But it sits right down here on the Bab el-Mandab, which we spend a lot of time worrying about the Suez Canal. Well, the other end of the Red Sea is the Bab el-Mandab, and Yemen sits astride it. Its big neighbor up here versus Saudi Arabia, and then you've got the Gulf states over there and Oman. It's a large country. It's about the size of Texas, and has a population of maybe 25 million, maybe 30 million. Nobody's really quite sure. So it's very large, very populous compared to all of its neighbors. But unlike its neighbors in the Arabian Peninsula, despite its size, despite its population, it has virtually no oil. It has an oil production of less than that of Bakersfield, California, which isn't much. And there are, despite the movie that some of you may have seen, Salmon Fishing in Yemen, there are no rivers, no lakes, no year-round fresh water in this country at all. So we're talking about a country with a population about the size of California, a landmass about the size of California, no resources to speak of. And all of this part here is extraordinarily high mountains, very rugged. And in fact, the capital, Sana'a, where I spent 4 years of my life, the city is, to kind of give you an idea how rugged this place is, the city is at 7,000 feet. It's a mile and a half up. In addition to not having water and oil, there's no oxygen. And to give you an idea, it is completely surrounded by mountains. So the city, the Sana'a Plain is a mile and a half up, and it's in a mountain range. So we're talking a very, very rugged country and an extraordinarily poor country. Probably the poorest country in the Middle East. It would be a second-tier country in sub-Saharan Africa, given its resources, but compared to its neighbors, it is extraordinarily poor. What I want to talk about is it was one of the countries that did go through the Arab upheavals, and I prefer upheavals to either spring or Arab awakening. One of the problems with calling it the Arab Spring is that it happened in December, January, and February, which is not the spring in the Middle East either. And the Arab awakening it gives you this idea of sort of everyone was asleep, that nothing was happening until December, or till January of 2011. So awakening kind of gives you this idea of this passive, moribund, nothing's ever happening area, and that's not accurate. So I'm going to call it the Arab upheaval. What is interesting about Yemen is, and we'll talk about some of the roots of the revolution or the upheaval, is that it's been a very different kind of revolution, and it's had a very different outcome so far. In about a week, on March 18th to be precise, Yemen is going to convene its national dialogue. This is critical. This is a critical, but not yet a sufficient step in Yemen's transition from 30 years of rule by Ali Abdullah Saleh to some kind of yet undefined political and social contract. The date is significant because it's going to be the second anniversary of what's called the Sana'a massacre. And during the demonstrations, there was one incident where 52 protesters were killed. So the date is very significant. It marks the real beginning of the revolution, and by having the national dialogue starting the same day, they're hoping to signal that this is the beginning of the real transition out. The event is significant because if this process succeeds, and we can discuss what success might mean, it will be one of the few, if perhaps the only, transitional process in the wake of the Arab upheavals that began over 2 years ago. We've all been watching what's been going on with Egypt. They're working their way through a political process, but they haven't gotten to the point of really having the kind of national dialogue they should. Bahrain has talked a great deal about having a national dialogue. It has not begun. And we know, of course, what's going on in Syria, and Libya is not doing much better. So the Yemenis are actually kind of ahead of everybody. They've got a national dialogue that is about to actually commence in about 7 days. And if it works, it's going to really signal that there is a way of working your way through these transitions. And if it works, if someone is looking for a tagline to the Yemen revolution, I would probably call it the negotiated revolution. How did Yemen get this far? Why did it manage its revolution so different from everyone else in the region? What is the national dialogue? Sounds nice, but what is it? And what are some of the obstacles and possibilities going forward? I'm going to start with first, what is this national dialogue? Well, first of all, the Yemenis have been talking about having a national dialogue for almost as long as I've been working on Yemen, and I started working on Yemen as a junior officer. It was often demanded by the opposition, but not ever really quite defined. It was occasionally promised by Ali Abdullah Saleh, but never actually quite happened. But as people would talk about it, the issue that they were really trying to talk about was a redefinition or a renegotiation of the political and social contract. The original May GCC agreement that ended the Yemeni revolution and started the transition process, and you hear a lot of talk about things are in keeping with the GCC process or in implementation of the GCC process. The original May agreement was only a page and a half long. And it really just basically said Ali Abdullah Saleh will step down, and that was about it. It was never signed by either side. There was a lot of talk about Ali Abdullah backing out and not signing probably 3 times. The opposition signed it, but they signed it at a very low level, kind of the plausible deniability level. And it probably, in retrospect, was just as well that no one did sign this agreement and it didn't go into effect. Because at a page and a half, it had no implementation. Just said the guy steps down. Well, now what do we do? It did frustrate people that nothing was signed, but probably just as well that it wasn't. In June, shortly after the last non-signing of the May agreement, there were several non-signing ceremonies. There was an assassination attempt against Ali Abdullah Saleh. An IED went off in the mosque in the palace. It killed a number of people, including a number of his senior advisors. Severely wounded Ali Abdullah. I met with him about 6 or so months later, and I was amazed that he had managed to survive. The bomb was basically right in front of him. But with the assassination attempt and his medical evacuation to Riyadh, rather than the opposition being in a position to step in, there was a vacuum. Basically, the political leadership, the government leadership, was either killed or on medical evacuation. Rather than the opposition stepping in and just simply taking over, in a lot of ways, the process kind of stalled out. That tells you an awful lot about the opposition's ability to get themselves organized. By mid-July, what there were competing declarations and proposals for a transition. And I have my students read through these daily situation reports that the National Democratic Institute was putting out. And after a while, you really start to see that what the Yemeni revolution was really a whole series of dueling declarations. One group would come out with a 6-point plan, and then another one would come out with a 12-point plan and a 10-point plan. And these plans, at last count, there were about 8 of them circulating even in July. So the process of talking about a transition went forward, but there was no real movement. Even though some of the key characteristics of each of the declarations were the same, no one would agree to anybody else's declaration. You know, either yours has points that I don't have, or I don't, you know, it was a lot of talk, no motion. By August, it started to coalesce. It started to come together around a few key principles. Excuse me, there's a thing down here. And in September, Ali Abdullah actually agreed to step aside. He said he would leave. And this took it to the next step. The core elements of the agreement were that there would be a transfer of power to the Vice President, Mansour Hadi. There would be elections to move it forward, and then there would be a 2-year transition process to rewrite, either revise, rewrite, redraft the Constitution. They do have one. Hold a dialogue, and very importantly, restructure the military. The violence was continuing while all this talk was going on. And in September, in 1 week, 100 Yemenis were killed. For Yemen, that was an extraordinarily high number. Looking now at what's going on in Syria, it was fairly minor. But the talks were going on, the efforts at coming to an agreement went on in spite of continuing violence. And there was one of the things that I think is important about the Yemeni revolution is that they got to the brink of real chaos, real violence, kind of looked into the abyss and said, no, that's not where we want to go. We don't want to be Libya. Syria had not really quite begun. They looked across the Red Sea and said, we don't want to be Somalia, we don't want to be Sudan. We want to figure out how to make this thing work. By late October, there was a UN Security Council resolution calling for a peaceful transfer, which Saleh endorsed. The opposition opposed, but Saleh endorsed it. And in late November, you had the head of what's called the Joint Meeting Party, which is this coalition of all the opposition parties. They're sort of like Saleh and everybody else. And the everybody else party, the JMP, it's a really odd political idea. It includes everything from former Marxists from the former southern Yemen, for those of us who can remember back in the day when there were 2 Yemens. Everything from former hardcore Marxist-Leninists through Nasserists, Baathists, Islamists, Royalists, you name it, they're all in the same party. And the idea that this thing is going to work has always been something remarkable to us. In some ways, it also tells you a lot about Yemen, is that they can have very deep political differences and still figure out a way to cooperate. But what you had in late November was the head of the JMP, who's actually from the Socialist Party, was meeting with Mansour Hadi, the vice president, working on the final points of an implementation agreement on transition. And they finally did come up with a final plan in November, and it included some elements that we've already talked about. The president would sign and then step down. The all of these various opposition parties would sign the implementation agreement. Full authority would go to Hadi immediately upon these signatures. The opposition would be given the opportunity to name the prime minister, so you've already got a divided government. There would be a broad government of national unity with the GPC, the government party, having one position, the JMP, the opposition coalition, having another. If the minister was from JMP, the vice minister was from GPC, and vice versa. So you had this kind of trade-off. Again, the military would be restructured, and there would be this revision or redrafting of the Constitution. This is a fairly detailed plan, and as I said, the original May agreement, the non-signed agreement, was a page and a half. This one was 30 pages. This was a detailed implementation plan worked out by both sides, and that's critical. November 23rd, Salo returned from Saudi Arabia and signed the agreement, and that was it. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Salo returned to Saudi Arabia. He had come back. He returned to Saudi Arabia, and the agreement was signed in Saudi Arabia. How many decades I've been working on this country, and I still get it backwards sometimes. What was interesting about that is the agreement had been negotiated in Yemen by Yemenis for what they wanted their own transition to be. When it came time to signing the agreement, they all decamped to Saudi Arabia. I mean, you're already here. You know, you can go down to the local Kentucky Fried Chicken and sign this damn thing. What was interesting is it was signed by the president, signed by Hadi, signed by a gentleman named Abdul Karim Miriani, who's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. The head of the Marxist Party, the head of the Islamic Party, the head of the UN Special Envoy, and then all of the ambassadors in Sana'a who had been supporting this transition process also got on a plane and went to Riyadh to witness the signing. There's actually a method to the madness. There are a lot of other players involved in these transition negotiations, many of whom were spoilers. A general by the name of Ali Mohsen, a band of brothers called the Al-Akmars, any number of people who thought they should be formal players in the transition process. If you had had the signing in Sana'a, they all would have wanted to be present, and they all couldn't be present. So by decamping to Saudi Arabia, you could keep the party much smaller. By mid-February, 90 days later, it was a two-phase implementation, a 90-day phase and then basically a 2-year phase. In 90 days, they had basically accomplished what they were supposed to do in phase 1. A prime minister had been named. There had been I would call it a presidential referendum. Mansour Hadi was the only candidate. He was the candidate of the opposition as well as the ruling party, and had been for some time. An interim government of national unity, had already been put in place. The military restructuring program was already underway. And there were discussions and debates about the dialogue. We weren't up to the dialogue yet, but we were discussing the dialogue. They did that in the first 90 days. That's a fairly remarkable step to already have taken. Phase 2, where they are now, is this question of actually convening the dialogue, establishing a constitutional commission, having a constitutional referendum, having new election laws, and then having a new election. So what we are getting next week is the formal beginning of phase 2. But they're a little behind in the timeline on one level, but they're actually doing pretty well. So what is this dialogue? You've got a country, 25 million people. You've got more political parties than I've ever been able to count. The last Nasserites in the world are in Yemen. The last Baathis are in Yemen. There's as I said, there's a royalist party, there's Marxist party, you name it, they got it. So they're going to have a dialogue with all these people. Oh, and the youth, the women, everyone else. It's going to be a very large party. Right now there are going to be 565 delegates to this national dialogue. So if you can imagine our House of Representatives and our Senate all trying to sit down at the same time and talk through our social contract. I'm not judging the Yemenis if they don't get this done in 6 months. It's a major undertaking. It's going to be extremely difficult because there are some very deep divisions. They have worked out a proportional representation that is, I think, only the math department here at Princeton could fully appreciate. The GPC, the government party, gets 19.8% of the seats. Why they're not getting 20% of the seats, I don't know. But it's 19.8. The Southern movement, we're going to talk about the South a little bit. The Southern movement is getting about 15%. Hadi gets 11% of the seats himself to a point. And I gave this talk earlier over at NES and noted to them that it is assumed that he's going to allocate these seats to, quote, marginalized groups and academics. No comment. The Islamist Party is getting about 9%. The youth, 7%. Women, 7%. Civil society, 7%. Socialists are only getting 6.5%. The Houthis, we'll talk about who the Houthis are. They are not a Dr. Seuss character. The Houthis are 6.5%. Nasserites are getting 5.3%. The last message of the Nasserites. Salafis, 1.2%. And then sort of partridges and pear trees. What's interesting about this is that each of these groups, while youth and women and civil society, which is largely women in Yemen anyway, have their own delegations and their own set number of seats. Every delegation must also be 20% youth, 30% women, and has to have some Southerners in it. I did ask one Yemeni if a young Southern woman is appointed, do they count it 3 times enough? And I didn't get much of an answer because they really weren't sure. But what it means is the dialogue is going to be broken down into 10 working groups with representation from all of these groups to work out various elements of the social contract, the election law, the form of government, all sorts of the basic questions of who are we as a government and who are we as a society. Every working group has to have 90% consensus. Now, the mathematics on this thing are just staggering. If every group has to have 20% youth, 30% women, even if they're young women, that means that the youth, the women, and Southerners are going to have a blocking veto. And so they are going to be fully represented. Their voice is going to be there. It is part of the Preparation National Democratic Institute, which is a democracy group that your tax dollar supports, is doing a whole series of orientation programs in batches of 50. And one of the things that they're doing is that these batches of 50 are going to have people from each group. And they're going to be talking about procedures and guidelines and formats and all of those kinds of mechanical issues. But obviously taking people through this kind of an orientation program is also a way of making sure they get to know each other, that they know how to work with each other, and so that when it all comes into plenary sessions and then goes into working groups, they're going to be, hopefully, go forward. What is it supposed to produce? Technically, it's supposed to produce guidelines for the Constitutional Convention, guidelines for the Electoral Commission, and get everything moving forward for the next round of elections. But as I said, what it really has to do is talk about what is Yemen going to be going forward. Let me talk a little bit about what Yemen is. I told you some of the basics. When Yemen was united in 1990, and contrary to the Christian Science Monitor today, it was not reunited. It had never been united. It was united in 1990. It was, let's see if I can make this thing work. There were 2 countries, North Yemen, which was sort of all of this, and then South Yemen, which went from Aden across and then all of that. And one of the ironies of Yemen is that South Yemen was actually east of North Yemen. And just to complicate it further, this part in here, which was part of North Yemen, is called Lower Yemen. So you have North Yemen, Lower Yemen, then South Yemen, which is actually to the east of North Yemen. And if you can get the geography of this country state, you're halfway there. When it was united, the North had been an imamate, a theocracy, a very medieval theocracy until the 60s. They had a Republican revolution, kind of Western-leaning with elements of kind of Arab socialist economy. Very poor, basically on our side. The South was actually made up of two pieces. Aden, which had been a British colony, very anglicized, educated, strong labor unions, major port, the second busiest port in the world in 1967, behind either Rotterdam or New York, depending on who you talk to. But this other part, all of this stuff out here, were all sultanates. They were British protectorates, and they had actually retained a very, very traditional form of government. And so what you had was this kind of Republican, sort of Arab socialist tribal north, and then an anglicized Marxist Aden, and then these very traditional protectorates out there. And they tried to put them together as one country. These people did not have a shared political history, had a very strong sense of national identity. So one of Yemen's major saving graces is that unlike Iraq, unlike Afghanistan, unlike an awful lot of countries, Mali is another one that is now on the front pages. Unlike a lot of these other countries that we've seen getting torn apart, Syria for that matter, Yemenis have a very strong sense of being Yemeni. There are two major religious groups, but they're not terribly far apart. There's not a sectarian divide the way we think of it in Iraq. There are no major ethnic groups. There's no major different language groups. Their histories kind of show they're a very diverse looking people. The folks from the Red Sea show an awful lot of their African heritage. People in Aden show a great deal of South Asia. People in the Hadramawt tend to look like Indonesians, largely because there's an awful lot of trade for several thousand years. So there's many different looks to a Yemeni, but they all saw themselves and saw each other as Yemenis, and that kind of held them together. But the political histories were very different. The sense of what the government is supposed to do for you, what you are supposed to do for the government. Is it a semi-liberal? Is it a sort of secular republic? Is it Islamist? What is it? And that was never really answered in the unification. The South kind of sued for peace, for unification, because their sponsor, the Soviet Union, had collapsed. But the basic questions of who are we, where are we trying to go, what are we trying to do, never got answered. They had a very brief civil war in 1994. Ours lasted 67 months, theirs lasted 67 days. In a sense, it answered the same question that ours did. It is a unified country. It is going to be one country. But it didn't answer any of the fundamental questions, underneath that. And so what this national dialogue is an attempt now to sit down and work out who are we? What kind of a government do we want? Are we going to be centralized? Are we going to be federal? Are we going to have autonomous regions? What is going to be the role of Islam? What's going to, all of these really big questions. What's the political environment that this is going to be going on in? The violence is pretty much under control. It is there, but the level has dropped considerably. Sense of personal security has started to come back. About 51% of the country thinks there was a recent poll by a very credible organization. About 51% of the country thinks it's headed in the right direction, which is pretty good. About 30% think it's going in the wrong direction. You go to the South, the numbers are not as good. But even in the South, about 30% think it's doing okay. So those numbers are not too bad. Those are enough for optimism. Curiously, a majority think the country is going in the right direction, but they think the current situation is getting worse. And I'm not really quite sure how you think you're going in the right direction while you think you're going backwards at the same time. But this is why I love Yemen. Hadi, the transition president, enjoys a very enviable 74% approval rating. That's pretty good. I don't know a lot of politicians who would object to having a 74% approval rating. It's only about 50-50 in the South. The South is the major issue. It's only about 50-50 in the South, but compared to Ali Abdullah, who still comes in at over 50% approval rating, even though he's now been out of office, but he's in the single digits in the South. So Hadi coming in at 50-50 is considered a major step forward. Hadi is also the first Southerner to be president of Yemen. And this is a major step. In fact, interestingly, the opposition appointed a Southerner as prime minister. The country, everyone kind of chose Hadi, a Southerner, as the president, and the Minister of Defense is a Southerner. So there's been a considerable change in the character of the country. So Hadi's doing very well. He's doing much better than everyone else in the country. When asked about the other elements of the government, the central government has about a 60% approval rating, has 69 disapproval in the South, big problem. Parliament is maybe 50-50. Our parliament would love to have a 50% approval rating. The judiciary is overwhelmingly disapproved by the country, which is odd. As judges generally are respected. And the local councils have a 60% disapproval. So Hadi has a lot of political capital. The rest of the government is on probation. Going in, what are some of the major concerns that everyone wants addressed, both in the transition and in the dialogue? We, the outside players, have put a lot of emphasis on the national dialogue has to work. The national dialogue is critical, and it is critical. But we are putting all of ours on national dialogue and on restructuring the military. To the Yemenis, ask the Yemenis what their major concerns are, and not surprisingly, 30% jobs, 30% prices in the economy. It's the economy stupid there as well. Secondary concerns, security, both kind of macro and micro personal security, education and corruption. So they have pretty basic, quality of life questions. In the South, the percentage concerned about corruption is much higher in Sana'a, the capital, but it's probably because they just see it a lot more. Curiously, which of the many, many parties do people think will do the best job taking the country forward? The government's policy, the government party, the GPC, gets about 38%. It's pretty good for a party that just got thrown out in the course of a revolution. A lot of that's probably name recognition. The other parties don't have a high recognition. The Islamist Party does come in more strongly on the helping the poor. It's about 53%, which is fairly common for Islamic parties. The 53%, yes, it's a majority, but it's not an overwhelming majority. It's a bare majority. But 68% of the population, almost 70% of the population says either all of the above or none of the above. So there's not a whole lot of nuance on their views on the parties. They're basically the parties. What do they think about the dialogue itself? Well, there's been, as I said, those of us who watch Yemen, we've been obsessed with the dialogue for about a year. Only 44% of Yemenis have any awareness of it whatsoever. It hasn't really registered with them. 52%, little or no recognition. There are, however, major differences based on where you live, your level of education, and gender. College-educated urban males, it's about 82%. College-educated or well-educated urban women, again, very high. And then as you start getting into the illiterate rural areas, it drops off precipitously. And again, that's not really unusual. These are not surprising numbers. They're just really kind of confirming it. Their confidence in, only 44% really have some to a great deal of even understanding that there is a national dialogue. But somehow or other, 2/3 of them think it's going to be a success. So it kind of comes down to, if you know about the process, you are encouraged by it and you have confidence in the process. And that's probably a good number. That, if you know that this is happening, you understand it's a good thing, you haven't written it off. So those are good numbers. In terms of what's the most important question facing the dialogue, and almost 60% said the South. the resolution of the grievances between the North and the South that have never been resolved since unification continue to plague the country. In the South does not even know itself what it wants. There are some who want federal status. There are others who want some kind of regional autonomy. And there are some who want full secession. But this recognition within the full country that if this problem of the South, it's really more the problem of Aden, is not addressed in the dialogue will fail. If the dialogue fails, the transition fails. And if the transition fails, the country will fail. So the focus is very much on that. Interestingly, those polled in the North understand and support the drive to try to resolve the Southern issue. They understand that there are legitimate grievances. They understand it has to be resolved. And so the South does have a body of support if they can come up with some legitimate resolution. When asked about the obstacles going forward, it's not the Southerners who get the lion's share of responsibility. 35% actually said the Houthis were probably the major spoilers. The Houthis, there weren't even Houthis when I was there. There is no ethnic group called the Houthis. There's no religious group called the Houthis. Basically, the Houthis come from the town of Houth, which is also known as Damascus. Houth was the center of the old Imami, the Royalists. The Royalists lost the revolution. The Royalists feel as if they have been marginalized and discriminated against. And to a large extent, what they're trying to do is push for a reestablishment of the Imami. Most people in the North, fellow Zaydis, you know, the Houthis are Zaydis, the Imam is a Zaydi. Most of the North, and the government has always been Zaydi. Most Zaydis do not support the Houthis. But the Houthis are seen as a major potential spoiler in all of this. They do not have support in the South at all. They don't even have support among their fellow Northerners. The other wild card is Saleh himself. Ali Abdullah Saleh is still living in Yemen. He is not in jail. He is not under indictment. He is living in his house. He is having a very nice time. He is having people over for coffee and God. He is kind of meddling a little bit in politics. He's giving speeches. He won't quite go away. Interestingly, though, he's not in jail. He hasn't been driven out of the country. He hasn't been arrested. He hasn't been put in jail. He only in the last couple of weeks was stripped of his presidency of the governing party. He's still there. He's still there with his family. He doesn't have a role in the dialogue at all. And in fact, the GCC maneuvering him out of his position in the party was one way of his party making sure that he didn't show up at the national dialogue. But he is still there. And he still enjoys about 50% approval rating. So whether or not, you know, he's going to try to spoil it is a question that people are concerned about. I don't think he will. I don't think he can. But his presence, his physical presence still in the country is an issue. Everyone is trying to convince him that he really needs to go on medical vacation again. You know, it's really time to go get some really serious burns, but get those taken care of again. He has said that he's going to leave town. My guess is that he will leave. If the dialogue starts on the 18th, he's going to leave on the 17th. He has, by the way, also inaugurated a museum in his own name before he leaves. You're president for 33 years. It's hard to let go. What can we legitimately expect from this process? A lot of us who watch Yemen, and there's a small group of us who watch Yemen a lot, actually think that they might pull this off. At a small conference last week on talking about all of this, and a friend of mine who's worked on Yemen almost as long as I have, said, we constantly underestimate the Yemenis. We constantly think they can't quite pull it off. They can't quite do it. And these are even people who actually kind of like the country in its own very, very bizarre way. And it constantly amazes. And in fact, the tagline for Yemenia Airways when I was there was, "Be prepared to be astounded." And we said, we're not really sure that's the best tagline for an airline. It was an accurate one in most cases. But Yemen kind of continues to astound. They tend to pull things out at the last minute. Their ability to kind of muddle through, it's never with great success, but it's never with abject failure. I once described Yemen as the always almost failing state. It never fails. It literally never fails to never fail. The most important thing is they've made the commitment that they want to have a political transition. That unlike other states in the Middle East, they're not going to do this by force of arms. They're not going to be a Syria. They're not going to be a Libya. Ali Abdullah Saleh, for all the fact that he was, the president for 33 years, not only did not turn his army against the protesters, he had his army protect the protesters from some other groups. They never got to that level of violence. And they want to make this work. What is interesting about the dialogue, the implementation agreement and the dialogue, is that this is almost wholly driven by the Yemenis themselves. There are some technical advisors there. NDI is doing orientation. We're there to help. But they're driving what is the agenda. They're going to drive what the solution is. And that, I think, is what gives most of us some hope that this is going to work out. I said at the very beginning that this was a necessary but not sufficient step. The reason it's not sufficient goes back to the polling data. The real issue is our jobs and the economy. This is a country that is overwhelmingly young. It is 60% under the age of 20, which means that when all those young girls grow up, we're going to have another baby boom. They've got one of the highest fertility rates in the world. It's somewhere well over 6. One of the highest fertility rates, birth rates, whatever you want to call it. It's extraordinarily high. As I said, they have no resources. They have a very poor education system. So they're not training these young people to take jobs, to have jobs. The government, as is often the case in this part of the world, is extraordinarily bloated and simply cannot absorb any more young people as civil servants. And so if this question of getting the economy up and running is not answered, and we, the external supporters and players, have about a year, which is about as long as I think the national dialogue is going to take, it's not going to be done in 6 months, to really get our act together and start coming up with plans and programs so that they can get this economy moving. We have, when I was in Yemen, I took our economic assistance program from 0 to 40 million. And I was very proud of myself because we were giving nothing to one of the poorest countries in the world. We've now just increased it to 350 million. And that's still not sufficient. We're not, by any stretch of the imagination, the major donor to Yemen at all. We're about 18. Our role, where we can be important or where we can help derail this, is while the military restructuring has been a very important part, and we have been helping on that, although the Jordanians have had the lead. One of the questions is going to be, and there was a very good conference a few months ago on where could Yemen go? One is it is a successful transition. Another one was reforms gone awry by going too fast, too furious, and failing. Hadi's been very careful not to make that mistake. Another one is it slides into business as usual. And the key indicator that they gave on it sliding into business as usual, which means nothing's happening, is that if there is an over-focus by outside players, read us primarily, on security issues. Security is important. AQAP is a real problem, absolutely, but it is not what is going to determine whether or not Yemen succeeds politically or economically. And in the long run, therefore, whether or not Yemen is a security issue. And so what we need to do is kind of give these guys the opportunity to muddle through, talk it through, at 565 people arguing like crazy for a whole year and not try to push it to do things on our timeline for our short-term interest. Because if we do it on our short-term interest, we're actually going to undercut what is our long-term interest, which is a possibly stable, successful, never prosperous, always muddling Yemen. Thank you. And Blue.
Exactly how young are people in the youth party? And
That's, yeah,
yes,
that's,
the other half is the party who is, it seems like there are a couple of individuals
Yeah.
that have extraordinary amounts of influence, and if something happened to them, it would be a major issue.
yeah. That's a very interesting question about youth, because I think when we talk about youth, we're sort of thinking of 20-somethings. Youth in this part of the world is actually anybody under 35. Tawakkol Karman, who some of you may have heard of, the woman who shared the Nobel Peace Prize, is a 35-year-old mother of 3. That's not what we would normally consider youth. So it's an older cohort, but it does include an awful lot of 20-somethings. And part of that is because even compared to the rest of the Middle East and the youth bulge that everyone talks about, in Yemen it really is extraordinarily young. The numbers are much greater. So 20-somethings going up to 35. You have, probably in any political system, but in the Middle East in particular, there is an enormous deference to age. And political leaders tend to come from the 50s to 60 crowd. Now, one of the problems in a lot of the other Arab countries where there were revolutions and rebellions is that the leadership was comfortably into its 80s. Saleh was probably 65, 66. He was relatively young by Middle East leader standards. But there is this kind of, it's a move down a generation, if not a generation and a half, that's going on. Way in the back?
Yeah, you said there's a need to get the economy going. What kind of economy might there be? What might they produce? What kind
That's
of,
a big-
they don't have water, so food must be a problem.
They, yeah, that's always the problem is we need to get the economy going, but using what? They don't have, as I said, they don't have any rivers, lakes, or anything. They do have aquifers, which they're depleting rapidly. By some estimates, even if Yemen manages to pull this thing out politically and on a few other levels, the Sana'a Plateau, which is obviously around Sana'a, could run out of water. They've been talking about it's going to run out of water almost at any moment for about the last 15 years, but it probably will. And Yemen could actually be one of the first ecologically failed states. When you've got, the entire plateau where the capital city is, it has no more water. What do you do? They exist largely on monsoon rain. It's the most terraced country in the world. We think of China and the Philippines and parts of Southeast Asia and their rice terraces. Yemen is actually a more terraced country. 12,000-foot mountain ranges, and they're terraced all the way up. I don't know how they did it. And they capture monsoons. Interestingly, it really is subsistence level living. Just across the Red Sea, you've got Ethiopia, which has had, one of my students is doing her senior thesis on it, so I should know the numbers, but they had 15 years of famine out of 20 years at one point. Yemen's just on the other side. Somalia, we know is an economic basket case. Yemen's never had a famine. They have managed to sort of have a barely subsistence agriculture that has kept everyone alive at a very high population rate. Never enough, everyone is slightly malnourished, but nobody is starving. There isn't any way to expand the agricultural production. The land isn't there, the water isn't there. The two things they have, and they both are going to take a great deal of investment. One is the people. You have a very young population. If it was educated and trained, had vocational skills and everything else, that can be an enormous driver of a strong economy. We're in a knowledge-based world. So if you could get these kids who, you know, the education system is very bad, if you could get a decent education system and some skills, you could then start having the basis of an economy, but that's a long investment. The other major resource they have is Aden Port. You can sort of see. And as I mentioned, before 1967, it was the second busiest port in the world. It's one of the best natural harbors in the entire world. You know, I took any number of people down there and they were just, you know, they'd never seen a harbor like this. It is equidistant between Singapore to one side, Durban, South Africa to the other, and Gibraltar going the other way. It was, you know, a gas station. It's the best located gas station in the world. It's protected from the monsoons by mountains. It doesn't silt up. It never has to be dredged. It has, the oil could easily come from the Hadramaut area over to Aden as a fuel supply. You can use desalinization to have water. You build a power plant. And I actually had one of my graduate workshops that I do over at Woody Woo look at, thank God for grad students, look at whether or not turning Aden into an international port was economically viable. And we even went to Djibouti to sort of look at their major competitor. Do not go to Djibouti in the Middle West. I went once on a hijacked airplane, which is the only way I would ever go, and I actually went back the second time with Woody Woo. It was, I don't know which was worse. What they discovered, you know, we went to Dubai, which Dubai Ports owns Aden Port, and of course they have some of the best ports in the world and run some of the best ports in the world. So we talked to the Dubaians. We went to Djibouti to look at a port in a, you know, dysfunctional third world country. Aden could be an international port again. And if you developed Aden as a port, and then you develop an industrial zone around it, where you're bringing in major components and you're assembling them and then putting them back on ships. You know, there's a very large labor pool there. It's not educated, it's not trained, but it's there. It's cheap labor. Yemenis are very hardworking people. Yemen has been exporting labor around the world for centuries, absolute centuries, if not millennia. So they're extremely hardworking. You build an industrial zone, you start doing, you know, basic assembly. You do major ships coming in, you break them down to feeder ships. And, you know, the student looked at this thing for 4 months and said, yeah, it'll work. It would create employment. As you're building Aden, you have to have construction workers. You know, it's that whole thing. It's a stimulus package. It pulls people out of the Sana Highlands, where there isn't water, down into a place where you can actually create water. So if someone said you get to go back to Yemen and come up with the economic survival plan, I would be putting donor money, donor focus, everything, get Aden up and running. If you try to do any other kind of economic development, something's going to have to come in and out of the country. It's going to have to go through the port. So let's do the port first and then work our way up into the country. And I think Aden Port could save the country, but it would take a major international effort to make it happen. But it's doable. Let me get this done.
Would you say a word about the influence of other big nations, China, Russia, and so on? What are they trying to do with Yemen, if nothing?
As I said, we're actually one of the smallest donors. The Russians are not big players in Yemen, and they're not really big players much of any place anymore. Chinese are sort of involved in some, but they've got a few other places that are more important. The country that is the most involved economically, well, two groups. One, the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Omanis, the Qataris are all major donors. Interestingly, the Emiratis just established a Ministry of International Development and Cooperation because they're a major aid donor. By the way, we are one of the UAE's major aid recipient countries. We are now on the recipient side of economic assistance. But the Emiratis are really getting into it. The Gulf states like to do big infrastructure projects, and so when we were looking at aid and port, for example, we thought about having the Gulf states come in and do a lot of the big infrastructure, the water plants, the electrical plants, the big stuff. And then one of the things that we and our G8 partners are particularly good at is human capacity building. So you build a hospital, we train the technicians, nurses, and everybody else. And you know, it was a good match. We don't build big stuff anymore. They're not very good at doing human capacity, so let's just figure out what we each do well. The Saudis are basically keeping Yemen afloat economically right now. What little economy they had has been very badly crippled by the revolution, as it has everywhere else in the Middle East. And the Saudis are basically paying to keep the government afloat. And that's good because nobody else could do it. The other big player, increasingly, are the Turks. The Turks are becoming big players in the Middle East, and they're becoming big players in Yemen as well. The last time I was in Yemen, I was at the Movenpick Hotel, and it was me and about 300 Turks. It was the Prime Minister was there with half of his cabinet and about 200 businessmen. And they were looking for investment, they were looking for all sorts of stuff. The Turks are becoming major players region-wide, but they're also becoming big players here. The Indians are big players in Yemen. Yemen, the traditional ties between Yemen and India, again, go back millennia. A lot of families have familial ties in South Asia. As I said, you go to Aden and you see a very strong South Asian imprint down there. You see it architecturally, you see it in the dance, you see it everything. So the Indians, the Turks, I think the Brazilians are. So a lot of the rising powers are involved in Yemen, and this is good because we're not going to put that much money in, but other people are. Whether it's sufficient is a different question. See if there's anybody over here. No? Ma'am.
What are the people like as a culture, staying from Saudi Arabia?
Oh, the Yemenis are so different. I used to tell people who would come into my embassy that if you serve someplace else in the Middle East, it doesn't really mean anything. That Yemen is unique. It has a very different history. It's because of geography. It's not really connected to the Gulf states historically. The Emiratis and Omanis do trace their roots to Yemen, to the Marib Dam, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, destroyed by small mice eating through to the bottom. That's the story. They're sticking to it. But it did, when the dam, there really was a dam, it really did collapse, and it had been irrigating a huge swath of the desert. And when it collapsed, all the tribes scattered. So there's kind of a creation myth diaspora story that is based in fact. And the Emiratis and the Omanis trace their roots to those tribes, which is another reason why they're major donors. The Yemenis are, as somebody described it, there's a great book called Baghdad Without a Map. It's about 20 years old. And this journalist sort of does 2 chapters on every country in the Middle East, and you get to the one on Yemen, and it's hysterical. He makes the point that in the rest of the Gulf states, you know, everybody dresses the same. You know, and when I was in Kuwait, we always try to figure out what an APB would sound like. You know, I'm looking for a 5'10" guy with a swarthy complexion, a mustache, wearing a white dish dash. Yeah. Okay, that's gonna help. The Yemenis are somewhat ethnically different. I will start by saying they're all tiny. It's a very, you know, I was literally head and shoulders above everybody in the country. I'm tall, even by American standards, and I have a tendency to wear really high shoes. The Yemeni dress, and it sort of says something about them, they managed to put together colors and patterns that no one has ever thought to put together before. Their traditional dress is called a futa. It is kind of this plaid-looking wrap. It's very almost Southeast Asian looking, generally worn with a plaid jacket, a mismatched shirt. I mean, it's just, it's, wow. So, you know, but what you get is, you know, someone said they're aggressively nonconformist. And it comes out in their dress. But they are a very open people. They are decidedly, you know, it's very straightforward. You know, when you're dealing with a Yemeni, you know exactly what you're dealing with. There's no games. And they are very individualistic, extremely individualistic. They're mountain folk. And like a lot of mountain folks, I don't know if you're talking about Scots or Kurds or, you know, whomever, there's something about living in mountains that makes you a, you know, kind of a rugged individual. And these guys are too. They do not take to rules, regulations, government, taxes, or much of anything else. It's kind of a libertarian country. It is, every Yemeni sees himself as his own master, which makes it an almost ungovernable country. They are some of the funniest people I've ever met, some of the nicest people I've ever met. I still have very good friends from Yemen. Very intense people as well. A very political culture, very political. They love to talk. They can talk for hours, days, months, and which is both their strong suit and sometimes their undoing, is that things get talked about forever. Sometimes things don't get done, but we talk about it. They care deeply about how they're being governed. And as I said, they don't take orders from anybody. It's a very almost impossible country to regulate. And as I said, it's their strong suit and it's their problem. They are very tolerant, extremely tolerant. They don't like the Saudis. They think the Saudis are intolerant and rather nasty, and the Saudis are rather nasty towards them, certainly. To give you an example, you know, half the country are Zaydis, which is sort of a Shia, and the other half of the country are Shafis, which is sort of a Sunni. But if the Iranians are here on kind of the Shia scale and the Saudis are here on the Sunni scale, the Zaydis and Shafis are kind of here in the middle. There are elements of their Sunni Shafi that actually borrow from the Shia. There's parts of their Shia tradition that borrow from the Sunnis. They worship in the same mosque. They are, you know, completely tolerant of sort of, you know, whoever you are, you know. You go to a number of countries and you kind of get stared at because you're different. And they're, you know, I'm walking around and like no one's paying me the slightest mind whatsoever. I do not look like a Yemeni. And so I found them, you know, both almost an exhausting people to be around sometimes because it's so intense, it's so political. Everything is done at such a level, and they're all deaf. The entire 25 million of them are hard of hearing. And so you're just, everything is done at a shout. Everything is done with full intensity. The humor is at full intensity. The politics are at full intensity. And sometimes you just go, oh my God. But they're delightful. I mean, they're wonderful. And when I went there as ambassador, we had no relationship with this country whatsoever. We had no aid, no trade. We were doing nothing with Yemen. We didn't care about it at all. What I discovered when I was doing my consultations around Washington was that everyone I talked to liked Yemen and wanted to do something more, but they figured that no one else in the government was interested, so they didn't bring it up. And I suddenly realized that everyone in the government wanted to do something in Yemen, and so I started putting it together. The other thing that I did was the Yemenis were their own best salespeople. And so what I started to do is that rather than write long, persuasive telegrams about the importance of Yemen to Western civilization as we know it, was I would bring people out. I would just say, if you're going to be in the region, just come down here for 2 days. You know, spend the weekend with me. You know, so it's a nice country. We've got great weather. It's really fantastic. And I would start having people come for 2 or 3 days, and they would fall in love with the place, and they would go back. And all of a sudden, I would have another convert, and I would start getting a little bit more money for education, a little bit more money for health care, and a little bit more money for this, and a little bit more money for that. And I had somebody say, what are you doing with people when they come to Yemen? They come back and they're converts. And I said, basically, I'm not doing anything. All I'm doing is giving them the opportunity to meet with and talk with these people and find out from them, you know, who are you and what do you want to do and how can we help? And so I think the other thing that really impresses people about Yemenis is that despite all of the data that tells you this is a hopeless country, no water, no oil, incredible fertility rate, you know, everything is wrong with Yemen. It should fail. It absolutely should be a failed state. There's no question about it, and it doesn't fail. And you get intrigued by why, you know, I can tell you all the centrifugal forces. What's holding this place together? And what you come away with is, again, sort of going back to this whole talk about the national dialogue, is that they want this place to work. And you kind of get caught up with, they haven't given up on it. Somehow or other, they're hanging in there, they're staying there. They want it to work, and so you kind of go, I guess I ought to hang around and try to help them. They haven't walked away. And so if they haven't, why should we? If you ever have an opportunity, if the situation settles down a little bit, you know, and you've got one of those outward bound kind of vacations you want to do, yeah, it's a beautiful country. It's stunningly beautiful. Architecturally, it is gorgeous. These great big high-rise buildings that are 800 years old with, they're built out of stone, and to seal the windows and the doors, they use a white gypsum. And so all of the buildings look like huge gingerbread houses. And the Yemenis claim that they invented stained glass windows. I don't know if they did. But all of these houses have stained glass half-moon windows at the top of all the windows. And so kind of at dusk, when there's enough light in the building that the stained glass is lighted up, but you can still see it, you've got these beautiful gingerbread houses with these beautiful stained glass windows. It's gorgeous. It's charming. And I guess the last thing is the Yemenis are very comfortable with themselves. They like being Yemenis. They still want it to work, but they like themselves. And so, you know, it's a very different place. It's very strange. 4,000 years to develop their own logic system, and you better just have to accept it. But it's great. You've been very patient.
What is the significance of Yemen to the United States national interest?
Very little on one level. Why is Yemen important to the United States? What's our strategic interest there? On one level, we really don't have any. We don't get oil from them. They don't have a port yet. You know, they've never really been an enemy of ours, so it isn't somebody we have to be nice to. They don't really affect, any significant, you know, they're certainly not going to threaten Israel. In fact, a goodly portion of Israel is from Yemen. The reason that Yemen is important to us, and when I was ambassador, I had to, you know, I basically had to answer that question at least once a year for my mission plan. And I would say, look, you know, in terms of national interest, in traditional terms, it really isn't an important country. You can make a case that it's astride the Bab el-Mandab and all of this stuff, but that's really kind of reaching. It's important to us because of national values. You know, if we do honestly believe that it's important for countries to be, you know, to have decent political governments, whatever, if it's a democracy or not, but a decent governance, a decent quality of life. You know, if those are our values, then supporting Yemen's efforts to attain those, not doing it for them, but helping them attain them, is very much in our national interest. Otherwise, we're kind of blind to everybody. It can be an important state. As I said, if AIM port really did become a major port, that would be very important to us. We go through there. The amount of ship traffic that goes through, the Bab el-Mandeb is most of the world's shipping. In a way, I can tell you why a failed Yemen is not in our interest more than I can tell you why a successful Yemen would be in our interest. A failed Yemen, you would have a 25 million person humanitarian disaster on your hands. You would have a major refugee problem on your hands. You could have, the Bab el-Mandeb, they've never threatened it, but they could. That would not be good for anyone. There is a security problem there. There is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula there. If Yemen were to become a fully failed state, if it were to become another Somalia, it would be a major problem for us. It would be a major problem for international shipping. It would be a major problem for the Saudis. It would be a major problem. And so I can't tell you exactly what interestingly, the traditional name of Yemen is Arabia Felix, which is Happy Arabia. I don't know quite what a Happy Arabia would look like or why it would be fundamentally important to us, but I actually had to check with a classic professor on what the opposite of Felix was. It turns out it's in Felix. It doesn't really work. But a failed Yemen would be a disaster for us and for our friends. And because it hasn't failed, and it doesn't want to fail, I think it's worth an investment to make sure that it continues to survive and maybe someday even figure out how to prosper.